My father worked at NASA in the 1980s. Not the version you see on TV. Not the tours, not, the rockets on posters, not the smiling engineers waving in front of cameras. He didn't talk about launches or astronauts or anything that made the news. When people asked what he did, he would give them something flat and forgettable, like systems work, and then change the subject before they could ask a follow-up question. As a kid, I thought that was normal. Every dad had something they didn't explain. Every job had parts that were boring or complicated or just not worth talking about. That's what I told myself when he came home late, loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of scotch, and disappeared into his office without turning on the light. He wouldn't sit at the desk. He wouldn't read. Most nights he just stood by the window and looked out into the yard like he was waiting for something to happen. If I asked him about it, he'd say he was thinking. If I asked him about work, he'd say it was classified. If I pushed any further, he'd give me a look that shut the whole thing down. So I stopped asking. He died last year. Wasn't sudden or dramatic. He got sick, went through the whole routine, and then one day there wasn't anything left for the doctors to do. The hospital called me early in the morning, and by the time I got there, he was already gone. They handed me a small plastic bag with his watch and his wallet and told me where to sign. The funeral was small, a few relatives, a couple old co-workers who didn't say much, and one man I didn't recognize who stood in the back the entire time and left before anyone could talk to him. Nobody told stories about NASA. Nobody mentioned anything specific. It was all careful, polite, and empty. A week later, I got a call about his storage unit. It was just outside of town, one of those long rows of metal doors with gravel between them and a keypad at the gate. I had to show ID and sign a form before they gave me the unit number and a temporary code. The manager told me my father had kept it for years, always paid on time, never missed a month. Inside, there were boxes. Not junk, not random clutter. Everything was organized in a way that made it clear he expected someone to go through it eventually. There were labeled containers stacked against the walls, old file cabinets with locks still on them, and a folding table in the center with a single cardboard box set on top like it had been placed there on purpose. I started with the obvious things. Old photos, manuals, a couple of cassette tapes and plastic cases, notebooks filled with tight, controlled handwriting, a NASA badge sealed in a plastic sleeve, the kind with his picture on it and a barcode underneath. I flipped through a few pages of one notebook, and I realized quickly that most of it wouldn't make sense without context I didn't have. The cardboard box on the table was different. Wasn't labeled, wasn't taped shut. When I lifted the lid, there was almost nothing inside. Just a thin folder. Plain. No markings on the front, no date, no signature. I sat down in the metal chair he'd left in the unit, and I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, clean, no letterhead, no logo. At the top, in small font, it said, "Facility Conduct Notes. Internal." That was it. No explanation or introduction, no indication of who wrote it or why. Below that was a list. 6 entries, short, direct, no extra words. They weren't labeled as strange or unusual or classified. There was nothing about them that tried to draw attention to themselves. If anything, they looked like the kind of thing you'd hand to a new employee on their first day and expect them to skim once before totally forgetting. But as I read them, sitting there in that storage unit with the door half open and the sound of traffic somewhere in the distance, it became very clear that they weren't normal rules. They were specific in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. They were written like someone had already seen what happened when you ignored them, and they were the only thing in that entire unit that felt like they weren't meant to be shared. I read them twice, then a third time. By the fourth, I'd already started thinking of them as something else entirely. Not conduct notes or guidelines, just rules. 6 strange rules my father had kept for decades without ever mentioning them out loud. I stared at the first one for a long time before I realized I was holding my breath. And then I set the folder down on the table, leaned back in the chair, and read it again. Rule 1. Never talk about Roswell. The first time I heard the word, I was 12 years old and sitting cross-legged on the carpet in our living room with the TV turned up louder than it should have been. It was one of those late-night specials. Grainy footage, dramatic music, men in suits talking about debris fields, and the government cover stories. They kept cutting to the same black and white photos of a ranch in Roswell, pointing at scattered material in the dirt, like it was supposed to mean something by itself. I didn't understand most of it. I just knew it felt important. They said it happened in the summer of 1947. A rancher found debris. The military showed up. They told everyone it was a weather balloon, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But then people kept talking. Pieces didn't add up. Reports changed. The story stuck around long enough to turn into something bigger than the original event. I remember leaning forward, trying to catch every word. And then my father walked in. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask what I was watching. He just stepped past the couch, picked up the remote, and turned the TV off in the middle of a sentence. The room went quiet fast enough that it felt like something had been cut loose. I looked up at him. "Hey," I started, more annoyed than anything. He didn't look at me right away. He stood there for a second, staring at the blank screen, like he was making sure it stayed off. Then he said, "You don't need to watch that." "It's just a documentary," I said. "It's about Roswell." And that was the first time I saw the expression he got whenever something crossed a line I didn't understand yet. Not anger, not exactly. More like something had shifted underneath him. He turned his head slowly and looked down at me. "You don't talk about Roswell unless you're being paid to lie about it." I remember sitting there for a second, waiting for him to explain that. He didn't. He handed me the remote, walked out of the room, and that was the end of it. At the time, I thought it was just another one of his rules, something arbitrary, something strict for no clear reason, the kind of thing you argue about when you're a kid and then forget about later. But I didn't forget it, and it wasn't the last time he reacted that way. A few years later, I was in the garage while he was working on something at the bench. The radio was on low, tuned to a talk station that drifted in and out between static. Something on the air started talking about recovered debris, about how it had been transported out of New Mexico and moved to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base under heavy guard. I didn't even think about it when I said it. "Is that where they took the Roswell stuff?" The sound of the wrench in his hand stopped immediately. He didn't look up at first. He set the tool down on the bench very carefully, wiped his hands on a rag, and then turned toward me. "Where'd you hear that?" he asked. "On TV," I said. "A while ago." He held my eyes for a few seconds longer than normal, and then he reached over and turned the radio off. The silence in the garage felt heavier than it should have. "You don't say that name casually," he said. "It's just a place," I said. "No. It's a problem," he replied. And that was the first time he expanded on it at all, and even then it wasn't much. He didn't tell me what happened in 1947. He didn't confirm anything. He just changed the angle. "Roswell is where things went wrong," he began. "Not just because of what they found, because of how many people got involved." I remember frowning, trying to follow what he meant. He picked up a small piece of metal from the bench and turned it in his fingers while he talked. "Too many eyes, too many hands, too many people who didn't know what they were looking at," he said. "Local police, military, civilians, reporters. It turned into noise." He set the metal back down. "Look, when something like that happens, the first priority isn't understanding it. It's containing it." He looked at me again. "And they didn't do that well enough." That was it. He didn't talk about bodies or ships. No long explanation about aliens or anything you'd expect from the way people talk about Roswell now. Just a big mistake. A messy one. Years later, after he died, I found a single reference to it in the folder. Not a full report, not even a paragraph. Just a line under the first rule. Ranch debris recovery, July 1947. And underneath it, material transported in sealed crates. No labeling, no public documentation. That was it. No mention of what the material was. No mention of where it ended up. Just crates, sealed, numbered, moved. When I read that, sitting in that storage unit, I realized something I hadn't understood as a kid. My father hadn't been trying to keep me from believing in Roswell. He'd been trying to keep me from talking about it. There's a difference. Believing something is one thing. It stays in your head. It doesn't move. It doesn't draw attention. Talking about it is something else. It spreads. It connects you to other people who are saying the same thing. It puts your name in the same space as a subject that certain people would rather keep quiet. I went back through the old photos in the storage unit after that. There weren't many from his work, but there were a few. Group shots, lab rooms, hallways with equipment I didn't recognize. In one of them, there was a man standing a few feet behind my father. Mid-40s maybe, clean cut, wearing the same badge and the same neutral expression everyone else had in those pictures. I didn't recognize him at first, and then I did. He'd been at our house once. I remembered him sitting at the kitchen table with my father, talking quietly while I was supposed to be doing homework in the next room. I remembered the way he kept his voice real low, the way he glanced toward the hallway, like he expected someone else to be listening. At the time, I thought he was just another coworker. Looking at the photo, though, something about him felt off. Not physically, not in a way I could point to. Just off. There was another photo, taken years later. Same building, same type of room. The man was in it again. But he wasn't standing with anyone. He was sitting in a chair against the wall, hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead. Everyone else in the photo was mid-conversation, looking at each other, moving naturally. He wasn't. I stared at that second photo a long time, and then I put it back in the box. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if it had anything to do with Roswell. But I do know one thing my father made very clear. Some things aren't just dangerous because they exist. They're also dangerous because of what happens when people start talking about them. Rule 2. If you see green slugs in the break room, never use salt. I didn't understand that one at all when I first read it. The first rule at least had a name I recognized, pointed somewhere real. This one didn't. It sounded like a joke someone slipped into a serious document to see if anyone was paying attention. I almost skipped it. And then I noticed the pages behind it. They weren't part of the typed sheet. Different paper, different ink. Some were photocopies. Some looked like originals. They'd been tucked into the folder in a way that made it clear they belonged with that line. I set the typed sheet aside, and I pulled the first one out. It was a photograph. Not a dramatic one. No flashing lights or men in suits. No sense that anything unusual was happening at first glance. Looked like a normal employee break room. Long counter, sink, a coffee machine that'd probably been there too long, a vending machine pushed into the corner, plastic chairs stacked against the wall. The kind of room nobody thinks about. And then I looked closer at the floor. There was something on the tile near the base of the vending machine. At first I thought it was a stain, or maybe a piece of trash that'd been kicked under there. It wasn't. It had shape. A thick, rounded body, maybe 6 or 7 inches long, tapering slightly at one end. The surface looked wet, but not reflective like water. More like something coated in a film. I picked up another photo. Same room, different angle. There were more of them now. 3, maybe 4, moving away from the machine and out into the open floor. You could see the trails behind them, thin, dark lines that curved slightly as they moved, like they weren't going in straight paths. They weren't random shapes. They were slugs. Green ones. I flipped to the next page. This one wasn't a photo. Typed, single paragraph, no header. Observed in employee break room. Movement slow but consistent. Avoid physical contact. Do not introduce foreign substances. That last line was underlined. I went back to the type sheet and read the rule again. If you see green slugs in the break room, never use salt. I felt something settle in my stomach when I connected the two. The next document was a report. Not long, maybe half a page, had a date on it, but no names. Incident occurred during standard cleaning rotation. Custodial staff member identified unknown organisms near vending unit. Attempted removal using available materials. I kept reading. Sodium chloride applied directly to specimen. Immediate reaction observed. There was a gap in the text there, like something had been removed or blacked out before it had been copied. Then it continued. Containment protocols initiated. Area sealed. Personnel cleared. Follow-up required. That was it. No description of the reaction, no explanation of what containment meant. Just the fact that something happened the moment salt touched one of those things. I went back to the photos and looked at them again. Slower this time. In the first one, the slug was near the vending machine. In the second, there were more of them, further out into the room. In the third, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the counter, just above where the floor met the cabinets, there were small white packets. Salt packets. One of them was torn open. The next page in the folder was different. Handwriting. My father's handwriting. They are not reacting the way anything here should react. The sentence was written once, then repeated below, slightly darker, like he'd pressed harder the second time. They are not reacting the way anything here should react. Under that, another line. Salt does not neutralize them, it triggers them. I sat back in the chair, and I looked at the stack of papers in my hands. There was another photo behind the handwritten page. This one was harder to look at. Same room, same angle as before, but something had changed. The floor wasn't clean anymore. There were streaks across the tile, not just the thin trails from before. Thicker, uneven, like something had spread and then been pushed or dragged. Near the center of the frame, one of the slugs was visible again, except it wasn't the same shape. It had opened. Not split cleanly, not cut. Opened. The surface had peeled back in places, exposing something underneath that didn't match the outer layer. The color was different, darker, and there were small movements inside it that didn't line up with the way a slug should move. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't something that had died. It looked like something that had been forced into a different state. There was a final note clipped to the back of the photo, typed again, short. Do not attempt removal with common agents. Do not escalate without clearance. Do not improvise. 3 lines, 3 warnings. None of them said what would happen if you ignored them. I thought about the break room again, about how normal it looked in that first photo, how easy it would be for someone to walk in, see something on the floor, and reach for whatever was closest. Maybe salt is the first thing some people think of. It's simple, immediate, something everybody understands. That's probably what the man in the report thought too. Just pour it on, watch it shrivel up, clean it off, and move on. Instead, whatever those things were, they reacted. Not by dying, but by changing. Rule 3. Do not ask about missing scientists. That one didn't come with photos. No diagrams, no reports with redacted sections, no images that forced you to sit there and study them until something clicked into place. Just paper, type sheets, lists, memos, and a pattern that didn't make sense until you stopped trying to explain it and just looked at what was actually there. The first document behind the rule was a personnel summary. Looked like something pulled straight out of an internal system. Clean formatting, columns, dates, department codes, names listed one after another with their roles beside them. Propulsion, materials, communications, theoretical modeling. Locations scattered across different facilities. Nothing unusual at first, and then I noticed the gaps. They weren't obvious unless you were looking for them. The names didn't stop abruptly. There weren't any big empty sections. It was subtler than that. Every few entries, there was a line that looked slightly off. A position listed, but no current assignment. A transfer note with no destination. A termination entry without a reason. I flipped to the next page. Same format, different department. Same pattern. Names that simply ended. No exit interview. No relocation address. No follow-up documentation. Just a clean break in the record. The next sheet was a memo. Short, internal tone. No signature. All personnel inquiries regarding reassigned or unavailable staff are to be directed through supervisory channels only. Do not seek clarification outside of assigned reporting structure. It didn't sound like a warning, it sounded like policy. I kept reading. Another page, another list. This one had locations attached to their names. Huntsville, Houston, White Sands, Greenbelt. Different facilities, different specialties, different teams. Same result. At some point, each of those names stopped appearing anywhere else in the file. Not transferred or promoted, not reassigned in a way that left a trace. Just gone from the system. There was a handwritten note tucked between two of the pages, my father's handwriting again. People don't disappear at that level without paperwork. Underneath it, if there's no paperwork, it's deliberate. I sat there for a minute, turning that over in my head. I've worked normal jobs. I know how hard it is to get anything processed cleanly. Promotions get delayed, transfers get logged wrong. People leave and their information lingers in the system for months before nobody closes it out properly. Nothing is clean or immediate, but these were clean. Too clean. Every one of those entries ended in a way that removed the person without leaving anything behind to follow. The next document was different. Not a list or a transcript or part of one. It read like a recorded conversation that had been typed out afterward. 2 speakers, no names given, just labels. Supervisor. You can't keep asking me that. Employee. I'm not asking anything complicated, I just want to know where he went. Supervisor. That is not your concern. Employee. He was on my team. Supervisor. He was assigned to your team, that's not the same thing. There was a pause marked in the text. Then the conversation continued. His desk is gone. Yes. His files are gone. Yes, they are. His wife called me. And what did you tell her? I told her I didn't know anything. Good. Because I don't. Keep it that way. The transcript ended there. No resolution, no explanation of what happened after. Just the conversation cutting off like someone had decided that was the only part worth keeping. I went back to the rule. Do not ask about missing scientists. I dug deeper into the folder, looking for anything that explained where those people actually went. There wasn't anything direct. No destination or facility name, no project code. Just absence. But there was one more handwritten page. Questions move faster than people. I read that twice before I understood what he meant. If you ask about someone, you're putting their name back into circulation. You're attaching yourself to it. You're making it visible again. And if something or someone is managing those disappearances, then visibility is the one thing you don't want. Under that line, there was one more sentence. At that level, asking is the same as volunteering. That was the closest thing to an explanation in the entire section. Not of where they went, of what happens to you if you push for the answer. I leaned back in the chair, and I looked at the stacks of papers spread out in front of me. No blood, no dramatic scenes, no evidence of violence. Just systems. Clean records, carefully controlled information, and people who stopped existing in any place you could check. I thought about the transcript again, about the employee asking where his coworker went, about the supervisor shutting it down, about the wife calling someone who didn't have anything to give her. I gathered the pages into a single stack, and I slid them back into the folder. Rule 4. If a government official demands answers, pretend you're complying. The documents here felt routine. Schedules, visit logs, a checklist that looked like it'd been copied and reused more than once. At the top of the first page was a date and a note. Visit. Oversight Committee. Under that, a list of names. Most of them meant nothing to me. One did. A senator I'd seen on TV before. There were timestamps next to everything. Arrival, security clearance, briefing window, facility walkthrough, departure. Everything was tight, controlled down to the minute. The next page was a preparation list. Ensure break areas are cleaned. Remove non-essential materials from open spaces. Confirm all visible workstations reflect approved activity. Brief all personnel on interaction protocol. That last line had a small mark next to it, like someone had circled it lightly. I flipped the page, more notes. Do not volunteer information. Do not correct assumptions. Answer only what is asked. Keep responses short. The next document looked like a script. Not word for word, but close enough. A series of common questions and acceptable answers. What is the focus of this department? Systems integration and long-term modeling. What are the primary funding sources? Allocations through standard federal channels. Are there any restricted projects currently active? All projects are conducted within established guidelines. Every answer said something without saying anything. I kept reading. There was a handwritten note in the margin of one of the pages. My father's handwriting again. Give them something to hold on to, not something to follow. I stopped there for a second, and then I pulled out the next sheet. This one was a summary. Typed clean like everything else. Committee escorted through designated areas. Questions remained within expected scope. No deviations observed. Visit concluded without incident. That phrase showed up more than once. Without incident. I went back to the earlier pages and I looked at the checklist again. If a room wasn't part of the plan, it didn't exist for the day. If a project wasn't meant to be discussed, it wasn't acknowledged. Everything the visitor experienced had already been decided before they walked in. There was another page behind it. Do not assume authority equals access. That line was underlined. Underneath it, there are layers beyond their reach. No explanation of what those layers were, just the statement. I leaned back in the chair and thought about that. From the outside, it's easy to assume that someone with enough rank can go anywhere, see anything, demand whatever they want. That's what people believe. That's what those officials believe. But this section made it clear that belief is part of the process. They're given enough access to feel satisfied, enough information to feel informed, enough structure to feel they're in control, and then they're guided back out. There was one last handwritten page clipped to the back. My father again. Short lines, direct. They don't have time to dig. They don't want resistance. They want confirmation. Below that, if you make them feel like they've seen everything, they won't look for what they haven't. And I could picture it. The visit, the smiles, the careful language. Someone asking a question they thought mattered. Someone answering in a way that felt complete. The tour moving forward before there was time to think about what hadn't been covered. No confrontation, no refusal. Just a controlled experience from start to finish. I gathered the papers and slid them back into place. Then I looked at the rule again. It was about managing attention, directing it, keeping it on a path that never intersected with anything real. Rule 5. Never bring your dog to work. It's the first rule that felt personal, not because of how it was written, but because of what was behind it. Up until that point, everything in the folder felt distant. Facilities, departments, people I didn't know, and places I had never been. Even when it got specific, it stayed removed from anything I had actually seen with my own eyes. This one didn't. There was a photo clipped behind the page. It wasn't from a lab or a hallway or any kind of controlled space. It was taken outside in a parking lot I recognized from other pictures in the folder. Same building in the background, same flat concrete, same low metal fencing that ran along the edge of the lot. My father was standing near the front of a car, and next to him was a golden retriever. I didn't remember the dog's name right away, but I remembered that dog. He'd been around for a while when I was younger. Real friendly. He would follow people from room to room, rest his head on your knee if you were sitting down, and stay close even if nobody was paying attention to him. Wasn't anything unusual about him, and that was part of why the photo stood out. I pulled out the next page. Just a short write-up, neutral tone, no names. Animal brought on site during off-hours access. Behavior normal until entry into lower corridor. I read that again. Lower corridor. That wasn't a phrase I'd seen anywhere else in the folder. I kept going. No visible stimulus present. No audible trigger identified. Behavior changed abruptly. Animal refused to proceed. I sat there for a minute looking at that sentence. Refused to proceed. Not attacked, not reacted violently. Just stopped. The next page was another photo, inside the building this time. A hallway, narrow, plain walls, the kind of space you pass through without noticing anything about it. There was a door at the end of it, no window, no label I could read from the angle the picture was taken. The dog was in the frame, low to the ground, not lying down, not sitting, pressed back slightly, like it shifted its weight away from something in front of it. My father was standing just behind him, one hand holding the leash loosely, like he hadn't expected to need to pull. There was nothing else in the hallway. I looked at the next page. Handler attempted to guide animal forward. Resistance increased. Another short gap. No physical obstruction present. Then, access point not engaged. Door remained closed. I went back to the photo, and I studied the door again. Didn't look different from any other door in the building. No markings or warning signs. Just a closed door at the end of a quiet hallway. The next sheet was longer, but the tone stayed the same. Animal exhibited signs of distress in proximity to secured area. No prior behavioral issues recorded. No environmental factors identified that would account for response. That meant they'd looked They checked for something that would make sense. Smell, sound, temperature. Anything that would explain why a dog that had never shown any kind of fear before would suddenly refuse to move. They didn't find anything. The last line on the page was the simplest: animal removed from sight. That was it. No follow-up or explanation. No conclusion about what caused the reaction. I sat there and thought about the dog for a while. Tried to remember anything about him that stood out when I was a kid. There wasn't much. He'd been normal. Just a normal dog in a normal hallway, refusing to move towards something that no one else could see. Rule 6. Never let your child out alone after dark. When I first read it, it didn't feel connected to anything else in the folder. The other rules pointed to specific places, rooms, facilities, systems that operated behind locked doors and restricted access. This one didn't. It sounded like something any parent might say without thinking twice. Stay close to the house. Don't wander off. Be careful at night. Basic, almost obvious. But there were more pages behind it. Not reports this time, not internal documents. Clippings, printouts, notes. The first one was a photocopy of a newspaper article. Small town layout, thin columns, grainy photo at the top of a wooded area with a search team standing near the edge of a trail. Missing child, search continues. The location was listed as Coconino County. The date was from the late 1980s. According to the article, the boy had been playing near the tree line behind his house just before sunset. His parents lost sight of him for less than 5 minutes, and that was enough. Search teams found footprints leading away from the yard and into the trees. They stopped abruptly. No signs of struggle, no broken branches, no drag marks. Just an end point. I flipped to the next page, another article. Different state. Baxter State Park. Hiker reported missing. Not a child this time, but the details felt the same. Last seen near dusk. Separated from a group by a short distance. Trail was well marked. Weather was clear. Search teams found his pack sitting upright near a bend in the trail. Nothing else? Now, the next page wasn't an article. It was a printed transcript from a radio show. Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell. Art was interviewing Linda Moulton Howe. I recognize the names because my father used to listen to those broadcasts late at night. The volume low, the room dark, except for the glow from his desk lamp. At the time, I thought it was just background noise. Now, though, I read the transcript differently. They were talking about cattle. Not missing, found. Spread across ranch land in different states. Colorado, New Mexico, Texas. The pattern was consistent. Animals discovered in open fields, sometimes within sight of fences or nearby roads. No signs of struggle. No tracks leading to or from the body. Precise removals of tissue. No blood on the ground. The kind of details that sound exaggerated until you realize just how often they repeat. The transcript didn't try to explain it. Just listed cases. Dates, locations, observations. One after another. The next sheet was my father's notes. Not organized into paragraphs, just lines written one after the other. Not random. Distance from structures matters. Edge of property, not center. Near tree line, not open field. I read those a few times. They weren't guesses, they were observations. He had been tracking this. Not as a hobby. As something that connected to what he'd seen or been told. There was another article. This one from Great Smoky Mountains National Park. A family reported their child missing during a late afternoon hike. The timeline was short. Less than 3 minutes between when the child was last seen and when the parents realized he was gone. Search teams covered the area quickly. Dogs were brought in. Nothing. No scent trail that went anywhere useful. No sign the child had wandered deeper into the forest. Just absence. I sat there for a long time after reading that one. And then I went back to my father's notes. There was a second set underneath the first, more specific. They don't come close to houses. They don't take from lit areas. They wait for separation. I remembered something then, not from the folder, but from when I was a kid. We lived on the edge of a neighborhood that backed up against a stretch of undeveloped land. Not deep forest, but just enough trees and brush to feel like it went somewhere if you walked far enough. I used to go out there in the evenings. Nothing serious, just walking, throwing rocks, wasting time. One night, I made it farther than usual. It was getting dark, but not completely. That gray time where you can still see shapes, but details start to blur. I remember hearing my father call my name from the yard. Sharp. I walked back, a little annoyed at being called in early. When I got close enough for him to see me clearly, he just said, "Stay closer to the house." That was it. I didn't think about it again until I was sitting in that storage unit with those notes in front of me. I flipped to the last page in the stack. It wasn't an article or a transcript, just a single line written the same way as the rule. They take what's far enough away to be easy. That was the only time anything close to a conclusion appeared. Not who they were, not where they came from, just what they did. I looked back at everything spread out on the table. The missing child near the tree line, the hiker who stepped off the trail for a moment, the cattle found in open land just far enough from any structure to be out of sight, the notes about distance and separation and timing. They weren't random. It followed a pattern that didn't require anything complicated to understand. If something was close to a house, it stayed. If something moved far enough away, it became available. That was the line. Not a fence or a road, just distance. I gathered the pages slowly, stacking them back in order the way I found them. And then I looked at the rule again. It didn't mention NASA, didn't mention facilities or departments or anything tied to his work directly. But it felt like the most serious one in the entire folder, because it wasn't about what happened in a controlled environment. It was about what happened outside of it. The folder went back into the box the way I found it. I didn't take anything out. I didn't try to reorganize it or make sense of it beyond what was already there. It'd been kept a certain way for a reason, and I wasn't about to start changing that after one afternoon in a storage unit. I closed the lid, sat there for a minute, just looked at it. 6 rules, no explanations or conclusions, just enough detail to make it clear they weren't guesses. When I finally stood up, I locked the unit, handed the key back to the manager, and I drove home without turning on the radio. The house felt different after that. Nothing moved. Nothing creaked that hadn't creaked before. But I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The way the backyard opened up just past the fence line. How quickly the light dropped off once the sun went down. How far the tree line really was when you stood in the kitchen and looked out through the window. I started locking the doors earlier. I put the folder in my father's old office. Same place he used to go every night after work. Same room he kept closed more often than not. I didn't change anything in there. The desk stayed exactly where it was. The chair stayed angled toward the window. The only thing I added was the box. For a while, I told myself I was done with it, that I had read what I needed to read, that going back through it wouldn't change anything. But every now and then, I'd find myself standing in the doorway, looking at the desk, Thinking about the way he used to stand there with a glass in his hand, staring out into the dark, like he was trying to pick something out of it. I used to think it was stress, work pressure, long hours, the kind of thing people carry home when they don't know how to leave it behind. That was the easiest explanation. It was also the one that made the most sense at the time. Now it doesn't. Now I think about the way he reacted to certain things, how quickly he shut down conversations that went in the wrong direction, how careful he was with what he said, even in his own house, how he never once tried to explain any of it in a way that would make it easier to ignore. He didn't overreact or exaggerate, he just set boundaries, clear ones, and he followed them. I still go into his office sometimes at night. I don't turn the lights on. I stand by the window the same way he used to, and I look out across the yard, past the fence, to where the ground dips slightly before the trees start. There's nothing out there most nights, just shadows and the outline of branches moving when the wind picks up. Looks empty. It always did. I used to think my father spent his whole life standing there because something in him was off, because he couldn't let go of whatever he dealt with at work. Now I understand better. He wasn't looking at nothing out there. He was keeping watch. Hey everyone, this is Steven. I hope you enjoyed tonight's story. Quick shout out, my friend Marcus has a new book, an audiobook, The Caretaker, out now. He's a very talented writer and I think you'll really enjoy it. There's a link to his work in the description. Thanks again for listening to tonight's story, and I hope you have a great weekend.